The first thing the Bay took from her was the taste of salt. It was a sharp, metallic bite that sat on the tongue, lingering even after the air began to thin. Inside the lung, the pressure was dropping toward a lethal vacuum, but Idris Sahel Marrow wasn't watching the dials. She was focused on the rhythm of her own molars grinding against a strip of dried, leathery goat jerky. A whistling hiss erupted from the inner hull as a micrometeoroid simulation punched a jagged hole through the steel. The sound was high, thin, and terrifying, but Idris didn't flinch. She reached into her ration pouch, fished out a piece of dry bread, and began to chew with a mechanical, eerie stillness. "Would you have stayed?" Because Idris didn't just stay, she brought a snack to the apocalypse. The morning had started with the usual tally of the broken. In the muster hall, the roster for Bay 14 was read aloud, and a heavy silence followed the announcement. Trainees called it the Screamer. In the last cycle alone, 36 cadets had been carried out of that chamber with ruptured eardrums or lungs that had simply forgotten how to expand. Idris stood at the back of the line, her posture as straight as a ledger line. Beside her, a cadet named Rohanna was shaking so violently her service pins rattled. Idris didn't offer a platitude. Instead, she reached into her breast pocket and felt the familiar hard edge of the tin canteen lid. It was a primitive thing hammered out of thin metal and etched on the underside with her grandmother's initials. Her grandmother had been a shepherd on the Anatol Reach, a place where the air was so thin it felt like drinking through a straw. She had taught Idris that the body is not a vessel to be filled but a machine to be tuned. "The mountains don't care if you're brave," the old woman used to say. "They only care if you can keep your jaw moving." Idris tucked the jerky back into her pocket as the heavy blast doors of the lung groaned open. Chief Hazards Examiner Aliurai Feshkaren stood in the observation booth, his 4 lateral gill flaps fluttering with a rhythmic, alien grace. He was a peladrin, a species evolved for the crushing depths of methane seas, and he viewed human physiology as a series of design flaws waiting to be exposed. On his forearm, a tattoo of 318 successful runs stood as a testament to his expertise. To him, Idris was just another statistical curiosity, a baseline mammal about to meet the limits of her soft, pressurized skin. He raised a ceremonial bone whistle to his lips and blew a sharp, piercing note that signaled the start of Phase 1. The seal hissed, locking Idris into the cold, yellow-painted belly of the chamber. She sat in the center on a chair designed for the 4-legged peladrin, her spine never quite finding a comfortable resting place. Above her, the telemetry pillar glowed a sickly amber. The air began to bleed away. Standard human protocol dictated a series of rapid, shallow breaths to oxygenate the blood, but Idris did the opposite. She slowed her heart until it was a dull thud in her chest. She took the jerky from her pocket and placed it between her back molars. As the pressure dropped from 14.7 to 9.2 psi, the chamber's sensors began to scream. A pulse readout for a typical cadet would be spiking into the hundreds by now, driven by the primal fear of suffocation. Idris's pulse fell to 68. In the booth, Aliurai leaned forward, his translucent inner eyelids flickering in confusion. He checked the oxygen mix, then the pressure sensors. Everything was functioning. The human in the chair simply wasn't reacting. At the 90-second mark, most trainees began to swallow convulsively, their bodies trying to force air into eustachian tubes that were buckling under the differential. Idris didn't swallow. She unhinged her jaw in a long, slow yawn that looked more like a predator's gape than a gesture of tiredness. A sharp click echoed in the silent chamber, picked up by the sensitive microphones. The telemetry pillar flickered, flagging the sound as an anomalous oral movement. It wasn't distress, it was an adjustment. Phase 2 arrived with the violence of a physical blow. The pressure plummeted to 4.1 psi in 11 seconds. This was the threshold where the screams usually started. At this level, the gases in the human gut expand, and the delicate membranes of the inner ear begin to tear like wet tissue paper. Idris bit down hard on the jerky. Her jaw worked with a frantic, rhythmic precision, left, right, left, right. Each movement was a calculated strike against the vacuum, a manual equalization that her ancestors had perfected while chasing goats through the thin, frozen peaks of the Reach. The telemetry pillar shifted from amber to a frantic, pulsing red. The AI, unable to find a category for the cadet's behavior, began to lag. It searched for signs of hypoxia or lung collapse but found only a steady, rhythmic grinding. Aliurai's gill flaps, usually so fluid, began to stiffen. He gripped the edge of the console, his fingers digging into the padding. He had watched hundreds of cadets fail, but he had never watched one eat. The sheer mundanity of the act was an insult to the lethality of the room. That was when the simulation turned real. A warning light on the secondary console flared white. A micrometeoroid, a stray piece of orbital debris no larger than a peppercorn, had pierced the station's outer shield and punched through the hull of Bay 14. The whistle was no longer a simulation. It was the sound of the station's lifeblood escaping into the void. The protocol was clear. The examiner was to hit the emergency repressurization and extract the trainee. But Aliurai didn't move. His gill flaps had locked open in a state of autonomic shock, a physiological quirk of his species when confronted with an impossible variable. He was paralyzed watching the telemetry as it spiraled into chaos. Idris, however, was already moving. She didn't look at the booth, she didn't look at the red lights. She adjusted the strap of her undersuit, a small habitual flick of the wrist that seemed absurdly calm given the circumstances. She stood up, the low pressure making her movements feel light and ghostly. She reached into her ration pouch and pulled out the piece of bread she had been softening in her mouth. It was a thick, glutinous mass now, a structural adhesive made of spit and starch. She took the tin canteen lid from her neck, scooped a single thumb of water from the rim, and mixed it into the bread until it was a pliable gray plug. With the steady hand of a quartermaster checking a ledger, she pressed the wet mass into the jagged puncture in the hull. The whistle stopped. The bread, instantly freezing in the cold draft of the leak, formed a temporary airtight seal. The chamber fell into a silence so profound it felt heavy. Idris sat back down. She took the last fragment of jerky, placed it in her mouth, and waited for the timer to run out. Through the observation glass, the freeze frame held for nearly 90 seconds. The bread plug glistened under the yellow lights, a humble bit of waste holding back the infinite dark. Aliurai remained motionless, his bone whistle forgotten on the floor, his achievement tattoos looking like a list of errors. The telemetry AI, having no pre-existing access for a human who repairs a hull with their lunch, finally gave up on its standard protocols. A new line of text appeared on the screen, flickering into existence as a permanent part of the station's archives. Subject-initiated equalization. The recovery cycle finally engaged, the hiss of returning air sounding like a long, exhausted sigh. When the heavy doors finally cycled open, Idris was the only person in the room who wasn't trembling. She walked past the medical teams and the stunned technicians without a word. She didn't need their validation, she had her grandmother's rhythm in her bones. By the next morning, the Hazards Council had issued a standing directive. The lower bound calibration for all human trials was raised by 1.4 psi, and a new mandatory module on jaw cycling was added to the curriculum. Idris's name was buried in the footnotes, a mere serial number attached to a procedural shift. Aliurai was moved to a different department, a sideways promotion into human liaison purgatory where he would spend the rest of his career looking at the faces of the people who had outpressured him. The evidence locker in the main lab now held a small hammered tin lid behind a pane of reinforced glass. It sat beside a long clinical label that explained its significance in the history of the Joint Frontier Corps. Idris didn't mind. She had a duplicate in her pocket, tucked away beside a fresh strip of jerky. Across the station, the Whistle Garden was quiet in the evening light. Idris sat on a stone bench, her jaw working slowly, methodically. She watched the stars through the thick viewing port, her breath steady and even. The jerky was tough, or rather, it was exactly as tough as it needed to be. She swallowed, adjusted her collar, and looked out at the void that had tried to take her salt. The tin lid in the evidence locker caught the stray light of a passing freighter. Beside it, a small piece of dried bread had been preserved in a vacuum-sealed jar. The shadow of a jaw moved rhythmically against the garden wall.